What's the worst thing your kid has done while drunk? I woke up to my son Andrew's bed empty and his brother Eric passed out fully clothed, reeking of cheap beer. They'd both moved back home after college and sometimes still partied like teenagers. I grabbed my phone and called Andrew, trying not to panic. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding exhausted and drunk. He said Eric had left him at Rosie's bar downtown and he was walking home. That meant 3 miles through sketchy neighborhoods at 3 a.m. intoxicated. I told him to stop walking and share his location immediately. The GPS showed he was still a mile away on Madison Street near the abandoned strip mall. I threw on sweatpants and grabbed my keys. The streets were empty except for delivery trucks, and I made it to Madison in under 5 minutes. But when I spotted Andrew, he wasn't alone. 2 police cruisers had him surrounded with their lights flashing. 3 officers were standing in a semicircle around my son, who had his hands visible and looked terrified. My stomach dropped as I pulled over and jumped out. I could hear one officer asking Andrew where he was going and why he was out so late. Another cop had his hand resting on his weapon. "That's my son," I called out as I approached slowly. The lead officer held up his hand, telling me to stop. He said they'd received a call about a man matching Andrew's description who was reportedly armed and having a mental health crisis. Andrew was wearing dark clothes and had been, stumbling along talking to himself, which probably looked suspicious to someone driving by. They asked Andrew if he had any weapons. He hesitated for just a second before shaking his head. That tiny pause made every officer tense up. They told him to turn around slowly with his arms out. As he turned, I saw him trying to catch my eye with this desperate look that made my blood run cold. The lead officer asked to search him for weapons. Andrew agreed, but his voice cracked. As the officer approached, Andrew suddenly said he needed to tie his shoe. Every cop immediately stepped back and told him not to move. The tension ratcheted up to unbearable levels. Andrew stood there frozen with one shoe clearly untied. They told him to keep his hands visible, and they would handle the shoe later. The search began, and I watched Andrew's face get paler with each second. When the officer patted down his jacket, Andrew made this small movement with his shoulder like he was trying to shift something. The officer noticed immediately and stepped back, ordering Andrew to remove his jacket slowly. Andrew took off his jacket with shaking hands. As he pulled his arm out, something started to slide from inside the lining. Time seemed to slow down as I realized what was happening. Andrew tried to twist his body toward me like he was going to toss me the jacket, but the officers were already shouting commands. "Don't move! Keep your hands where we can see them!" The jacket fell to the ground, and something metallic clattered on the pavement. All 3 officers drew their weapons, pointing them at my son. I couldn't breathe. Andrew dropped to his knees with his hands up, sobbing that he was sorry. The thing that had fallen from his jacket lay there in the streetlight's glare. It was a pistol. Andrew was crying, saying he'd forgotten it was there, and panicked when they asked about weapons because he knew he'd been drinking and didn't want to get in trouble. The officers kept their weapons drawn while one approached to secure the pistol. They ordered Andrew to lay flat on his stomach with his arms spread. I watched my adult son face down on the cold pavement while police decided whether to arrest him. The officer I'd coached with years ago looked at me with disappointment that hurt worse than anger would have. They cuffed Andrew and read him his rights while I stood there helpless. The charge would be carrying a concealed weapon and lying to police. His attempt to hide it and possibly pass it to me had made everything worse. As they put him in the cruiser, Andrew looked at me through the window, mouthing, "I'm sorry," over and over. I followed them to the station in my car, trying to figure out how to help him. This wasn't teenage mischief anymore. This was adult consequences that could affect his job and future. At the station, I called our lawyer while Andrew was being processed. The sun was coming up by the time I could finally see him. Andrew looked broken, sitting in the holding cell. He kept saying he'd just panicked and made stupid choices. The gun had been in that jacket for weeks and he'd forgotten about it. Then he'd been too drunk and scared to think clearly. While waiting for the lawyer, I got a text from Eric asking where everyone was. I told him to get to the station immediately. When he arrived still hungover, I showed him the arrest report. His face went white. Then he said something that changed everything. "Mom, I planted that gun in his jacket tonight. My legs went weak, and I had to grab the plastic chair next to me to stay upright. The waiting room spun around me, and I could taste metal in my mouth like when you bite your tongue too hard." Eric stood there looking at his shoes while my brain tried to make sense of what he'd just said. The words kept repeating in my head, but they didn't feel real. Before I could say anything, the station doors swung open and our family lawyer rushed in carrying her briefcase and looking worried. I practically ran to her and grabbed her arm hard enough that she winced. I pulled her away from Eric and whispered that he'd just confessed to planting the gun on Andrew. Her face went from concern to pale in about 2 seconds. She looked over at Eric, who was still standing by the chairs, then back at me. She walked straight to Eric and put her hand on his shoulder. "Don't say another word to anyone about anything," she said in this firm voice I'd never heard her use before. She guided us both to the corner of the waiting room, away from the desk sergeant who was typing on his computer. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and started firing questions at Eric so fast he could barely keep up. When exactly did he put the gun in the jacket? Where did he get it? Who else knew about it? Did he tell anyone his plan? Eric's hands were shaking as he tried to answer. His voice cracked when he explained that he'd been mad at Andrew for years. Andrew always got better grades and more friends and their dad's attention before he died. Andrew got into the better college and got the better job, and everyone always asked about Andrew first when they called. Last night, when they were getting ready to go out, Eric saw Andrew's gun in his closet where he kept it in a shoebox. Something just snapped in him, and he took it and hid it in the lining of Andrew's jacket while Andrew was in the shower. He knew Andrew never checked that jacket because he only wore it when it was cold. He figured Andrew would get pulled over for drunk driving or something, and the cops would find it and he'd get in trouble. He never thought it would go this far with arrests and lawyers and Andrew facing real prison time. By the time he finished explaining, tears were running down his face and snot was dripping from his nose. The lawyer handed him tissues from her purse and kept writing notes. She explained that we had to tell the prosecutor about this immediately, but we had to be smart about it. Eric could face serious charges for evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. The fact that he was coming forward voluntarily would help, but it wouldn't make the charges disappear. She said both boys were in serious trouble now. We followed her out to her car in the parking lot where she spent the next 2 hours on her phone. She called the prosecutor's office and Andrew's arraignment attorney and tried to negotiate some kind of deal. I sat in the back seat watching Eric in the passenger seat as he stared out the window. Every few minutes she'd put the phone on mute and explain what was happening. The prosecutor was skeptical about Eric's story and thought maybe we were making it up to help Andrew. The arraignment was still happening that afternoon, but now with this new information they might reduce bail. She kept emphasizing that both boys needed separate lawyers now because their interests weren't aligned anymore. Around noon we drove to the courthouse for Andrew's arraignment. The courtroom was small and smelled like old wood and floor polish. Andrew shuffled in wearing orange jail clothes with his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked smaller somehow, like he'd shrunk overnight. Our lawyer presented Eric's statement to the judge, who looked disgusted by the whole situation. After 20 minutes of legal arguments, the judge agreed to release Andrew on reduced bail with strict conditions. No alcohol, no weapons, no leaving the state, and weekly check-ins with pretrial services. I had to put up the house as collateral, which made my stomach hurt, but there wasn't another option. When Andrew walked out of holding that afternoon, his hair was greasy and he smelled like the jail soap they give everyone. I hugged him even though he stayed stiff in my arms. Then I told him about Eric's confession. His whole face changed like someone had flipped a switch. First he looked confused like he didn't understand the words. Then his eyes got wide and his jaw tightened. Then his face just crumpled and he looked exactly like he did when he was 8 and his hamster died. He planted it? He kept asking over and over. The drive home took forever even though it was only 15 minutes. Andrew sat in the passenger seat taking these sharp breaths through his nose like he was trying not to scream or cry or both. His hands were balled into fists, so tight his knuckles were white. I kept both hands on the steering wheel and focused on the road because if I looked at him I'd start crying too and we'd probably crash. When we pulled into the driveway, Andrew was out of the car before I even put it in the park. He went straight for the front door and headed down the hall toward Eric's room. I had to run to get in front of him and block the doorway with my body. Andrew tried to push past me, but I planted my feet and grabbed both sides of the doorframe. Behind me, I could hear Eric crying and saying he was sorry over and over. Andrew started yelling about trust and family and how could Eric do this to him. Every word got louder until he was screaming about betrayal and jealousy and how Eric had ruined his whole life over nothing. I grabbed Andrew's shoulders and pushed him back down the hallway while Eric kept sobbing behind his closed door. Andrew fought against me at first, but then his whole body just went limp and he let me guide him to the kitchen. I sat him down at the table and started making coffee with shaking hands while he stared at nothing. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed while I stood there trying to figure out what rules would keep my sons from destroying each other. I poured 2 cups and sat across from Andrew, who still hadn't moved. I told him flat out that from now on there would be no drinking in this house, period. His head snapped up and he started to argue, but I cut him off. I said every weapon had to be removed from the property immediately and the brothers could never be alone together. Andrew looked at me like I was some stranger who'd taken over his mother's body, but he didn't argue with my tone. Eric came out of his room 20 minutes later with red eyes and sat at the far end of the table. I repeated the rules to both of them, and neither one said a word. They just nodded and avoided looking at each other while I went through the house collecting anything that could be used as a weapon, including kitchen knives that went into a locked drawer. The rest of that day passed in awful silence with Andrew in the living room and Eric hiding in his bedroom, and me walking between them, making sure they stayed separated. I barely slept that night listening for any movement in the house. The next morning my phone rang at 7:30 and the caller ID showed the district attorney's office. Zachary Diaz introduced himself as the prosecutor assigned to Andrew's case and said he'd heard about Eric's confession through our lawyer. His voice was professional, but I could hear the skepticism underneath when he asked about the timing of Eric coming forward. He wanted to know why Eric waited until after Andrew was arrested to admit what he'd done. I explained that Eric had been drunk and then hung over and hadn't realized how serious things had gotten until he saw the arrest report. Zachary made this sound like he was writing something down and said he was willing to investigate, but we needed to cooperate fully with his office. He scheduled an interview with Eric for later that week and reminded me that both boys still faced serious charges. After I hung up, our lawyer called within 10 minutes, saying she'd already filed formal requests for all the police body cam footage from Andrew's arrest. She explained that we needed every piece of evidence showing Andrew's panic was real and not some calculated attempt to hide the weapon. The footage would show his confusion and fear, which would support Eric's story about planting the gun. She also warned me that the prosecutor would be looking for any sign we were making this up to. Help Andrew. While I was still on the phone with her, an email popped up from Solomon Gould at Andrew's accounting firm requesting an urgent meeting about his employment status. My stomach dropped because I knew what that meant. The lawyer said Andrew needed to go to that meeting and be completely honest about the charges. The firm had strict policies about criminal cases, and trying to hide it would only make things worse. I scheduled the meeting for the next day and spent the rest of the morning calling therapists until I found one who could see us immediately. Liliana Sutton specialized in family crisis intervention and had an opening that afternoon. I booked it without even asking the boys because we were way past the point of this being optional. Both of them went to the appointment without arguing, though they sat on opposite ends of the waiting room. Liliana met with all three of us first to understand the situation, then said she needed to see each son individually. While the boys were in their sessions, I sat in my car checking my email every 2 minutes. The police report had just arrived as a PDF attachment, and my hands shook as I opened it. The officer's notes were detailed and clinical, describing every moment of the arrest. The worst part was reading about Andrew's suspicious shoulder movement when they patted down his jacket and his attempt to twist toward me like he was going to toss it. The report used words like consciousness of guilt and attempted concealment. That made everything sound so much worse than it had felt in the moment. Even knowing the truth about Eric planting the gun, the report made Andrew look guilty as hell. I forwarded it to our lawyer, who called me back within 5 minutes. She'd already started developing what she called a two-pronged strategy to handle both boys' cases. For Andrew, she'd push for a plea deal, reducing the charge to a misdemeanor possession instead of concealed carry. For Eric, she'd negotiate separately to avoid jail time for the tampering and obstruction. She said neither outcome was what we wanted, but given the evidence, it was the most realistic path forward. The alternative was going to trial, where Andrew could face years in prison if convicted. 3 days later, Eric had his first solo session with Liliana while Andrew was at his meeting with Solomon. I waited in the parking lot for an hour until Eric came out looking exhausted. On the drive home, he admitted that he'd told Liliana about being jealous of Andrew since high school. He said Andrew had always gotten better grades and more friends and awards, while Eric felt invisible no matter what he did. The gun thing had been a drunk decision to knock Andrew down a peg, but he never thought it would go this far. I wanted to scream at him, but I just kept driving. That same week, Andrew started his court-mandated alcohol assessment meetings as part of his bail conditions. He went to the first one angry and defensive, but came home quieter. After the third meeting, he sat with me on the back porch and admitted he needed to figure out why he drank until he blacked out. He said the meetings were making him look at patterns he'd been ignoring for years. 2 weeks into the legal process, Zachary Diaz called again with what he called a signal about the case direction. He said he was willing to consider reduced charges for Andrew, but remained skeptical about the whole situation. In his view, possession was possession regardless of how the gun got in the jacket, though Eric's tampering did matter for sentencing considerations. He wanted both boys to take plea deals that included probation and community service rather than risk trial outcomes. Our lawyer called the next morning about getting the gun tested for fingerprints, but warned the crime lab had a 3-month backlog. She said this was normal, but made building our defense harder without that evidence. While she worked on expediting the testing, I started gathering any paperwork that might help Andrew's case. I found old receipts in the filing cabinet and bank statements showing purchases from 2 years ago. One charge caught my eye from a gun store downtown for $400. I called the store, and after some back and forth, they confirmed Andrew had bought a pistol there in his senior year of college. The serial number matched the weapon from his arrest. This changed everything because Eric hadn't just grabbed some random gun to plant on his brother. He'd specifically taken Andrew's own weapon from wherever Andrew had stored it. I drove straight to Eric's temporary place at my sister's house an hour away. He was sitting on the porch when I pulled up, and his face went pale seeing me. I showed him the purchase record and watched him crumble. He admitted he'd been snooping in Andrew's room looking for cash to borrow when he found the gun in a shoebox. He knew Andrew kept that jacket in the hall closet and never checked the pockets. Eric figured Andrew would be too drunk to remember anything when they went out that night. The plan was supposed to be a harmless prank to get Andrew in minor trouble, not arrested at gunpoint. I sat there on my sister's porch steps feeling sick while Eric cried and apologized. Part of me wanted to protect him, but I couldn't let Andrew take the fall for something his brother orchestrated. I called our lawyer from the car and told her we needed to share everything with the prosecutor immediately. She tried to talk me out of it, warning that Eric could face serious charges, but I insisted. Protecting one son by letting the other suffer wasn't something I could live with. The lawyer set up a meeting with Zachary Diaz for that afternoon. We sat in his office while she laid out the timeline and evidence, including Eric's full confession. Zachary listened without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair looking tired. He said Eric could be charged with evidence tampering and obstruction of justice, which carried up to 5 years in prison. Now both my sons were facing jail time instead of just one. Our lawyer spent the next 2 weeks negotiating with both prosecutors trying to work out deals. She finally got Zachary to agree to a tentative arrangement where Andrew would plead to misdemeanor weapon possession instead of the felony charge. Eric would plead to obstruction, but avoid the tampering charge. Both boys would get probation, fines, and community service, but no jail time if the judge approved. The officer I'd coached years ago called and asked to meet for coffee. He sat across from me at the diner looking uncomfortable but sincere. He said he'd been following the case and felt bad about how things turned out, but he also wanted me to understand that Andrew's choices that night were dangerous, regardless of how the gun got there. Walking drunk at 3 a.m, lying to police, trying to hide evidence, those were all serious mistakes. I nodded because he was right, even though it hurt to hear. Word had already started spreading through our neighborhood about the arrests. People whispered when I walked by and stopped inviting me to things. Rather than let rumors run wild, I decided to tell close friends the basic truth. Both boys made terrible choices. Consequences were coming, and we were dealing with it as a family. Most people were supportive, but some clearly enjoyed the drama. Solomon called me directly about Andrew's job situation since Andrew was too. Scared to face him. The accounting firm couldn't keep someone facing weapon charges on staff during tax season. Solomon placed Andrew on unpaid suspension immediately with the understanding that any conviction would mean termination. Andrew had worked so hard for that job, and now it was slipping away. The weeks crawled by with meetings and paperwork and court dates. 6 weeks after that horrible night on Madison Street, we all gathered for the pretrial conference. Both prosecutors presented the proposed plea deals to the judge while our lawyers argued for acceptance. The judge reviewed everything carefully, then looked at both my sons standing there in their suits. She said she'd consider the agreements but wanted time to review the full case file. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following week, which meant 7 more days of waiting and wondering. Andrew had stayed sober through all of this and attended his required meetings without complaint. Eric had started volunteering at the food bank even before his community service would officially begin. Both of them were trying to show they could do better, but the damage was already done. The night before the plea hearing, I couldn't sleep and found both boys sitting at the kitchen table unable to sleep either. We didn't talk much, but sat there together facing whatever came next. The next morning, Liliana showed up at our house for the therapy session she'd arranged weeks earlier. She set up chairs in the living room so we all faced each other in a triangle formation. Andrew sat with his hands clenched in his lap while Eric kept looking at the floor. Liliana explained the rules about speaking from personal experience and not interrupting. She asked Andrew to start by sharing how Eric's actions affected him. Andrew's voice cracked as he talked about feeling betrayed by the person he trusted most. He said the worst part was thinking he'd done something so stupid while drunk when really his own brother had set him up. Eric started crying and said he was sorry over and over. Liliana made him be more specific about what he was apologizing for. Eric admitted he'd been jealous of Andrew getting better grades and more attention since they were kids. He said planting the gun was meant to knock Andrew down a peg, but he never thought cops would get involved. Andrew listened without interrupting, then said he accepted the apology, but couldn't trust Eric anymore. The session lasted 2 hours, with both boys crying and admitting things they'd kept inside for years. When Liliana left, she gave us homework to write letters to each other that we'd read at the next session. That afternoon, Andrew showed me his new rideshare app on his phone and the monthly subscription he'd bought. He also signed up for an alcohol monitoring program through his phone that tracked his sobriety days. He downloaded 3 different apps for finding AA meetings and marked the ones closest to our house. I watched him delete all his drinking buddies' numbers from his contacts. He threw out every bottle from his room, including the cologne that smelled like whiskey. The next day, my sister drove over to help Eric pack his stuff. They loaded his clothes and computer into her SUV while Andrew stayed in his room with the door locked. Eric left his key on the kitchen counter and hugged me goodbye. The house felt weird and quiet after he left. I kept walking past his empty room expecting to see him there. That weekend, I spread all the bills across the dining room table. The lawyer fees alone were $12,000. Court costs added another $3,000. The monitoring programs for Andrew cost $200 a month. I opened my banking app and moved money from savings to checking. The vacation to Hawaii I'd been planning for 2 years got canceled with no refund since it was too close to the travel date. I called the credit card company to increase my limit just in case. Both lawyers called that week to discuss the final plea agreements. Andrew's lawyer explained he'd plead to misdemeanor possession and get 2 years probation with mandatory alcohol counseling. Eric's deal included pleading to obstruction and evidence tampering with 18 months probation and 200 hours of community service. Neither boy would serve jail time if they completed their probation successfully. We all met at the lawyer's offices to sign the paperwork. Andrew read every page carefully while Eric just signed where. They pointed. The plea hearing got scheduled for the following Thursday at 9 in the morning. I took the day off work, and we all dressed in our best clothes. The courthouse metal detector beeped when Andrew walked through because he forgot to take off his belt. He looked panicked until the guard just waved him through after checking the belt. We sat in the hallway waiting for our case to be called. Andrew kept wiping his palms on his pants legs. When they called his name, he stood up so fast he almost knocked over his chair. The judge asked him to approach the bench with his lawyer. She read the charges out loud and asked if he understood them. Andrew said yes in a voice barely above a whisper. The judge asked him to speak up. He cleared his throat and said yes again louder. She asked if anyone had forced him to take this plea. He said no. She asked if he was entering the plea voluntarily. He said yes. Then she asked him to describe in his own words what happened that night. Andrew told the story about walking home drunk and having the gun in his jacket. He admitted lying to the police when they asked about weapons. The judge accepted his plea and sentenced him to 2 years probation with mandatory alcohol counseling twice a week. She told him any violation would mean immediate jail time. Andrew nodded and thanked her. We had to wait while the probation clerk prepared his paperwork. Then they called Eric's case. He walked to the bench looking pale. The judge went through the same questions about understanding the charges and entering the plea voluntarily. When she asked Eric to explain his actions, he started crying. He said he'd put the gun in Andrew's jacket because he was jealous and stupid. The judge's face got hard as she listened. She said betraying family trust was one of the worst things a person could do. She sentenced him to 18 months probation and 200 hours of community service at a location to be determined by his probation officer. She also ordered him to write a letter of apology to the court explaining why his actions were wrong. Both boys had to surrender any firearms they owned within 48 hours. The bailiff explained the guns would be destroyed at the police facility. Neither of them owned other guns, but the symbolism hit hard. Andrew's probation intake appointment was scheduled for the next Monday. The probation office was in a strip mall between a payday loan place and a smoke shop. Andrew filled out 20 pages of forms while I sat in the waiting room. The officer explained he'd have to report monthly and submit to random drug and alcohol testing. Any travel outside the county required written permission 2 weeks in advance. He couldn't be around anyone with a criminal record. He had to maintain employment or be in the school full-time. The list of rules went on for 3 pages. Andrew signed everything and got his first drug test that day. The cup had a temperature strip to make sure the sample was fresh. 2 days later, Solomon called me directly since Andrew was too scared to call him. Solomon said the accounting firm had a policy about criminal convictions, but he valued Andrew's work. He offered to let Andrew return in 30 days at 70% of his previous salary. If Andrew completed 6 months without any probation violations, they'd review raising his pay. Andrew had to agree to monthly check-ins with HR and couldn't handle any cash transactions. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being unemployed. That Saturday morning, Eric drove himself to the community food bank on Maple Avenue for his first shift. He parked his car and walked through the loading dock where volunteers were already unloading trucks. The coordinator handed him a bright orange vest and pointed him toward the sorting station. Eric spent 4 hours separating canned goods from boxed items while other volunteers packed them into bags. His hands got dirty from dusty cans and his back hurt from bending over boxes. During his break, he took a picture of himself wearing the volunteer vest standing by stacks of food. He sent it to me with a text saying he was working hard. The next weekend, he went back and worked the produce section, throwing out rotten vegetables and bagging fresh ones. He kept sending me photos every shift like he needed me to see he was really there. After 3 weeks, Liliana scheduled a family session at her office downtown. We sat in her beige waiting room until she called us in together. She had us sit in separate chairs forming a triangle so everyone could see each other. She pulled out a blank piece of paper and started writing rules we all agreed on. Andrew said he wanted advance warning if Eric would be home when he got back from work. Eric agreed and said he wanted Andrew to stop ignoring him completely in the house. I added that both of them needed to contribute $500 monthly toward household bills. Liliana wrote everything down and had us each sign the paper like a contract. She made copies for everyone and said we'd review it next month. 2 days later, I heard a knock at the front door around lunchtime. The officer I'd coached stood on my porch in his uniform looking serious but not angry. He told me the department had closed Andrew's case file with no further action needed. The prosecutor wasn't pursuing any additional charges, and the investigation was complete. He said Andrew got lucky that Eric came forward when he did. I thanked him, and he nodded before walking back to his patrol car. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with all the legal bills spread out. The total came to almost $30,000 between both lawyers and court fees. I called the lawyer's office and set up a payment plan for $1,500 a month. My savings would cover the first few months, but after that, things would be tight. I'd have to cancel my gym membership and stop eating out for lunch at work. The cable package would have to go down to basic channels. I made a budget spreadsheet tracking every dollar for the next 2 years. 6 weeks after the court date, Andrew reached his 60-day sobriety mark. He made spaghetti for dinner and set the table with the good plates we rarely used. While we ate, he mentioned he'd been sober for 2 months now. He said the cravings still hit him some nights, but his head felt clearer than it had in years. I told him I was proud of him and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. He squeezed back and kept eating his pasta without saying anything else. The following week, Eric spent all Sunday writing a letter to Andrew. I saw him at the dining table with several crumpled drafts in the trash. He finally finished one and left it on Andrew's bed while Andrew was at work. When Andrew got home, he found the 3-page letter and read it in his room. I could hear him moving around up there, but he didn't come down for an hour. When he finally came to the kitchen, he just nodded at Eric and said thanks. Eric nodded back, and they both went to their separate rooms. Liliana suggested the brothers meet for coffee with her there to help guide the conversation. They picked a Starbucks near her office on a Tuesday afternoon when it wouldn't be crowded. I dropped them both off and waited in the parking lot. Through the window, I could see them sitting at a corner table with Liliana between them. Andrew kept his arms crossed while Eric leaned forward talking with his hands. Liliana would say something, and they'd both nod without looking at each other. After 40 minutes, they all stood up and walked out together. The ride home was quiet, but not angry like before. That night, I typed up new house rules and printed them on regular paper. Each son had assigned chores on specific days and consequences if they didn't complete them. Groceries would be split 3 ways, and receipts had to be saved for reimbursement. No guests after 10 on weeknights, and everyone had to text if they'd be home after midnight. Both of them read the rules and agreed without arguing about any of them. They started doing their assigned tasks without me having to remind them constantly. 3 months after everything started, we finally had a normal dinner together. I made pot roast and we sat at the table talking about a new Netflix show. Andrew mentioned a funny video from work, and Eric laughed at the story. Nobody brought up lawyers or probation or court dates or anything heavy. We discussed the weather getting colder and whether the local team would make the playoffs. It felt strange but good to have a regular conversation without walking on eggshells. The next morning, Solomon called Andrew into his office after the weekly staff meeting. He told Andrew his work quality had improved significantly over the past month. He mentioned that if Andrew kept performing at this level, they could discuss raising his salary back up. Andrew came home that night with actual energy in his step for the first time in months. That Saturday, Eric texted me a picture from the food bank where he was sorting canned goods into boxes for families who needed help. He stood next to a stack of boxes he'd filled that morning, wearing the bright orange volunteer vest they made everyone put on. The food bank coordinator walked by and patted him on the shoulder, which made Eric smile in a way I hadn't seen in months. He stayed an extra hour past his required time helping load trucks for delivery routes. When he got home, he mentioned maybe going back next weekend, even though his community service hours for that week were already done. Andrew overheard from the living room and looked up from his laptop but didn't say anything negative about it. The next week, Eric signed up for 2 extra shifts at the food bank on top of his required hours. He started learning the regular volunteers' names and helping train newer people on the sorting system. One afternoon, he came home talking about how they'd served 300 families that day and needed more volunteers for the holiday rush coming up. I watched him actually caring about something beyond himself for the first time since high school. Andrew kept going to his meetings and checking in with his probation officer every month without any issues. 6 months after that awful night with the police, he brought home a sobriety chip from his group and left it on the kitchen counter where I'd see it. He'd gained back some weight he'd lost during the worst drinking months, and his skin looked healthier. His hands didn't shake anymore when he poured his morning coffee. At work, he stayed late finishing projects, and Solomon mentioned during a phone call that Andrew was handling more complex accounts than before. The house felt calmer with both boys following their routines and staying busy with positive things. Eric finished enough community service hours that the court said he could move back home if he wanted. We sat at the kitchen table going over new rules I'd written down on regular notebook paper. He had to pay $300 monthly for rent and groceries. No drinking in the house at all. Home by 11 on weeknights. He read through everything twice and signed at the bottom without arguing. When he moved his stuff back from my sister's house, Andrew helped carry boxes upstairs without being asked. They worked in silence, but it wasn't the angry silence from before. The brothers started eating dinner at the same table, though they sat at opposite ends. They'd pass the salt without making eye contact, but at least they weren't leaving the room when the other walked in. I noticed Andrew would sometimes leave Eric's mail on his bed instead of just throwing it on the counter. Eric would wash Andrew's coffee mug if it was in the sink with his dishes. Small things that showed they could exist in the same space, even if they weren't ready to be brothers again. I found myself enforcing boundaries I never would have before all this happened. When Eric missed his curfew by 20 minutes, I locked the door and made him sleep in his car. When Andrew skipped a meeting to watch a game, I took his car keys for 3 days. They both looked shocked at first, but then started following the rules better. I wasn't trying to be their friend anymore. I was being their parent, even though they were grown men. The change felt weird but necessary after everything we'd been through. Andrew's probation officer sent paperwork saying he was approved for work travel within the state. He called me from his office excited about being able to visit client sites again instead of just doing video calls. Solomon had already assigned him to a project in the capital that would need monthly visits. Andrew bought new dress shirts and got his car detailed for the first time in years. He looked professional again instead of just getting by. That confidence I used to see was starting to come back in small ways. Eric got an email about acceptance into the business program at the state university for spring semester. He'd applied months before everything happened and forgot about it during all the legal problems. The program would let him take night classes while working during the day. He showed me the acceptance letter at breakfast and actually looked hopeful about something. He'd need to finish his last 50 community service hours while taking classes, but the schedule would work. Our last session with Liliana was on a Thursday afternoon at her office downtown. We sat in the same chairs we'd been using for months, but the mood felt different this time. She asked us each to share one thing we'd learned through everything. Andrew said he learned he couldn't run from problems by drinking them away. Eric said he learned that jealousy could destroy everything if you let it control you. I said I learned my sons needed structure more than they needed me to protect them from consequences. Liliana nodded and wrote some final notes in our file. She reminded us that healing wasn't finished just because therapy was ending. We'd have to keep working every single day to maintain the progress we'd made. The boys both had years of probation left, and I had years of different parenting ahead. But we were moving forward instead of just surviving each day. The parking lot felt strange walking out together knowing we wouldn't be back next week. Life settled into patterns that would have seemed impossible during those first terrible weeks. Andrew went to work and meetings and checked in with his probation officer. Eric went to classes and the food bank and paid his rent on time. I kept the house rules posted on the refrigerator and enforced them consistently. We ate dinner together most nights, talking about safe topics like weather and sports. Trust was growing back slowly, like a plant that had been cut down to the roots. Some days felt almost normal, and other days the weight of what happened sat heavy in the room. But we kept going through the motions until they started feeling less like motions and more like actual life. Thanks for letting me question things right alongside you. It's been a ride just wondering together. Until next time, take care out there. Like the video, it helps more than you think.